things that our recent research has been looking real closely at are assumptions about how people in the past were tattooed. And there are a lot of claims by archaeologists and by scholars that are totally unsubstantiated. And we have the data and the ability to go through these things and actually evaluate them in a meaningful way.
That's a lot harder than just making shit up, though, Aaron, like everyone else used to do.
It is so much more difficult than making shit up.
And if you recognize one of those voices, that is Dr. Matt Lauder. You're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony. You already heard Matt. And we're joined by yet another guest. And this week we are reaching hands across the aisle for Matt to heal the academic bridges that he burned in a previous episode, saying that all archaeologists are hacks and don't know anything. They don't know anything about history.
Anthropologists. It's anthropologists.
Oh, sorry, anthropologists, not archaeologists. But we are joined by incredible archaeologist Aaron Deter Wolf. Aaron, introduce yourself. Say hello to the people.
Hey, thanks guys for having me. Yeah, so I am the prehistoric archaeologist for the state of Tennessee. Division of Archaeology. We have around 32,000 recorded archaeological sites in Tennessee, and my part of that is every site that postdates the last ice age and dates to before about 1475 AD. So I work exclusively with ancient Native American sites and artifacts.
So what particularly brings you onto this show for anyone who might be unfamiliar with your work?
Sure. So I fell down a tattooing rabbit hole probably about 10 years ago or so at this point. We were starting to look at some of the effigy ceramics that come out of various Native American cultures. So these are ceramic pots and vessels that are made to look like humans, like people, and frequently have depictions of body decoration on them. And we're starting to talk just a little bit, just informally, about whether these might be tattoos or scarification, or how would we know the difference, and turn to the ethnohistorical records, so the accounts of the first Europeans who brought the written word with them to the Americas. And when you look at those accounts, starting with the very first European to set foot in the Western Hemisphere, one of the first things that virtually every account does is it notes that people were tattooing. You all have talked about the vocabulary involved in that, right? They're not using the word tattoo yet. They're saying they're raised, they're pounced, they're pricked, piquer in the French. They're using different words, but from the context of those accounts, it's clear that what they're describing is tattooing, and it's on virtually every Native American group from the Arctic all the way down to the tip of South America. From every ecozone on both continents, there is tattooing taking place. And so this started to bother me because I'm a material culture kind of guy. Like that's really what I like about archaeology is the interpretation and the understanding of the material culture of the things that are left behind. And at that point, there had been maybe a dozen artifacts in all of American archaeology, in a century or more of American archaeology, that had been identified as being tattooing tools. And so to me, this seemed like this fundamental disconnect between a practice that we knew existed broadly and was very significant to the cultures that were doing it, and this virtual void of archaeological knowledge about those same practices then, right? I mean, it would be like doing archaeology and not being able to identify houses that people lived in, right? Like it's kind of an important part of how they went about their daily lives. And so, this kind of stuck with me, and this question of, is it not there? Are we not looking for it? Are we seeing it and we just don't know what it is? And so this then sort of spiraled out into this, decade-long cycle of trying to wrestle with these questions, both in North America and more broadly across the world. And, lately that's ended up with me working with South American mummy tattoos and all kinds of things in between. So that's really where I come into this then, is trying to think about that material culture of ancient tattooing, for pre-literate societies, groups who didn't write down, hey, we were tattooing with this bone. How can we 3,000 years later as archaeologists reconstruct that in a meaningful way? so that we're actually not as, Matt would say, maybe talking out our asses, but actually, saying things that are meaningful to the people who would have been making and using those tools.
And I think, so one of the first conversations we had, Aaron, or one of the ones that I really remember, was the conversation which you've published a few pieces on, several pieces of work on now, which is exactly the techniques by which you started to try and do that work, right? To go, what is recorded in the archives, and how can we tell a tattooing tool from a not tattooing tool, right? Because that's been a problem, not just for archaeologists in the Americas, but also archaeology more generally, right? Like, this problem exists across everywhere. There's how can we tell a sewing needle from a tattooing needle from a medicinal needle? Is there even any difference? Is the same thing used for multiple things? So one of the things when I'm writing about your work and I'm talking about it, I talk about the techniques you develop to try and find tattooing needles in the existing artifacts collection. So do you want to talk a bit about that? Because I think I've called you a gonzo archaeologist, I think, in writing. So do you want to talk about how you did that?
So experimental archaeology is this sort of subfield of archaeology where you learn by doing. And your listeners there in the UK may particularly be familiar with it. There's some really great, like, living archaeology and experimental archaeology that happens in Europe and in the UK in these sort of living history sort of settings. And something people might think is, well, you go out and you build a Neolithic house using the same materials and the same footprints and sizes and everything that you're finding in the archaeological record. And by doing that, you understand better how people in the past actually built those houses. And so this has been basically, for me, the same process with tattooing, right? Is this idea that we have these sort of glances or glimpses into the past, into the technologies that were used through a combination of ethnographic data, through a combination of information from traditional cultural practitioners, living tattooists working today in those cultures, and then from the archaeological record. And so trying to sort of rectify those lines of evidence and then take those pieces from the archaeological record and actually test them out. So if you have, be it an account saying a certain tool was used, or a 2-century-old Victorian archaeologist who just kind of waved their hand and said, well, those needles are obviously for tattooing. Well, the idea then is, let's give that a try. And so what the experimental archaeological process has been like then is making those tools, so manufacturing them as authentically as possible. So using, for example, stone tools to make bone needles. So we try to stay away from the Dremel tools and the metal knives and stuff unless it's appropriate, and then testing those. And the process began on pigskin, and then over time, sort of. Let's be honest, if you're going to sit around with traditional tools tattooing pigskin, after a while, someone's just going to be like, what we should really do is give this a try. And in our case, what happened was what we were looking for was the use wear, micro wear, right? So this idea that every single tool that humans use leaves behind microscopic wear patterns. So like if you use your kitchen knife for cutting meat exclusively, the microscopic wear patterns on that knife will look different than on a knife that you're using to whittle wood with.
And that's a pretty standard set of, increasingly kind of, with scientific tools, increasingly intricate, but that's a pretty standard method in archaeology, right?
Yeah, it goes back several decades to researchers looking at like, Oldowan toolkits, right? These flake tools from millions of years ago in Africa, and trying to figure out, were these 5 million year old tools used to butcher flesh, or were they used to whittle wood or cut grasses? And so, there's processes in place for this. And in my mind, where we land on this is that the microscopic wear pattern on a tool that's used to tattoo, so to pierce living flesh to a very shallow degree, is going to look different than the wear patterns that form on what could be a visually identical tool that was used to, say, punch holes in leather for making clothes, or used to push fiber together to make basketry, or used to decorate pottery. So what happened with us then in using these tools on pigskin, which pigskin is a forensic proxy for human skin, right? It's what people use for crime scene investigations. The structure is about the same, the depth of the epidermis.
Like literally before we just came on this call, I'm writing something at the moment, and I was reading this report from 1829 where they found this pirate vessel and a barrel of like pork, but in it was tattooed human arms.
Amazing.
So not just a proxy for archaeologists, but also a proxy for pirates, clearly.
Well, I mean, archaeologists are the pirates of science, so that works. That's good. So, we were using this on pigskin, but then eventually we got to the point where someone asked this really important question, which is, how do we know that dead pig skin and live human skin will create the same results? And at that point, you just got to rip that Band-Aid off, and you're like, well, someone is getting a bone needle tattoo tonight. and in my case, there were a couple people who were working on this with me who were part of those early experiments, but also it was one of these things of, I couldn't ask anybody to do something that I wasn't going to do myself. And I'm right-handed, so it started on my left wrist and sort of went from there. And
you were tattooed already, right? Like, so you had tattoos before you started this. So
yeah, I did. Yeah, and that was actually part of my interest going into it. Right, was as a tattooed archaeologist and knowing the number of archaeologists that have tattoos of ancient art. Why wasn't this part of the discussion? I don't know how it is in the UK, but here in the United States, we used to have those old style museums where you'd have the living dioramas. Where they have like the lice guys. Most of the people in those are naked because they're non-Western and ancient, and none of them ever had tattoos. And so again, it was this idea that like we're missing this fundamental piece of history. And so then using these tools, having tattooed ourselves and tattooed pigskin, we then can look at them under the microscope and figure out what the wear patterns look like. And in fairness, it wasn't actually me that figured that out. Finally, it was Christian Gates St. Pierre who finally did the good work of determining exactly what that wear pattern signature looks like. And because of that, now we can pull tools out of archaeological collections and look at them under microscopes and say, was this tool used on flesh? Was it used on leather? Was it used on something completely different?
And what have you discovered?
Well, so we use that use wear pattern to then we've looked at a number of tools here from the Americas. And so I was a second author on a paper a couple years ago that identified a 2,000-year-old set of cactus thorns from Utah that were used to tattoo. And the wear patterns on those is very, very similar. It basically comes down to, the surface being rounded but not broken, and the extent of the polish that sticks up those spines then. So, you think your epidermis is generally about 2 millimeters thick over the course of your body. Well, that's your sweet spot then. If you find something with 5 millimeters of use wear on it, that's not going to work, right? That is being jammed way on down.
I've met some tattooers that might have managed 5 millimeters in my time, I tell you.
And I'm sure there were scratchers in the past, we have glimpses of that, right? Not everybody did good work. And so I'm sure that's out there. But also, if you look at the quality of the tattoos that are shown in, the ethnographic accounts or the early historical paintings or even, figural art going back for thousands of years, this is good work. This is not primitive cavemen sitting around, stabbing each other with sharpened sticks they pulled out of the fire. It may have started that way, but that's not what it turned into. And then we were able to use the same set of wear patterns then on a group of turkey bone needles from here in Tennessee. And the dating on those is a little intricate, but they're probably about 5,000 years old. So to date, those are the oldest conclusively identified tattooing tools in the world.
And that was about 1,000 years older than previously thought, right? Or the previous evidence had.
Yeah, at least. Yeah. Yeah, we have the bone tools from Tennessee, and there are some obsidian tools from the Pacific that I think date to about 3,000 years old or so. And then the cactus spines from Utah are the next ones after that. Now, keep in mind that there's a lot of, going back to the Ice Age archaeology, there have been people waving their hands wildly and saying, these are for tattooing,
yeah.
But none of those...
problem.
Right. None of those are confirmed. Those are just like best guess intuition, oftentimes not by tattooed people, or people who knew anything about the practice. And so that's sort of been the process of debunking this thing that is working to promote the idea that we can do good work, right? We can do responsible, informed work and not just fly off the handle and be like, it's sharp, it's for tattooing. So
that's probably a good way to actually to segue in terms of like responsible stuff. Because the other issue, so again, what I love about your work is it's very conservative in a way in terms of the claims you want to make. Like you really stick to the evidence in a very inspiring way. And as we were chatting about a bit before Tom turned the recording on, like there's a lot of people in this tube tattooing who haven't really stuck to the evidence before them. And I guess the problem that you have, and this is what I'd love to hear you talk about a bit more, is how you marry that very narrow scientific evidence as a contemporary scientist with obviously the cultural histories of tattooing in the communities that you're studying, but also the kind of really complicated legacies of trauma and genocide that have erased a lot of the history and practice of those cultures. Like, how do you manage that? I mean, on an intellectual level, even on a day-to-day level, working in those field sites.
That's a great question, and it is very difficult. And over the course of my career, it has become more difficult. Let's be honest. I mean, I'm 46, and when I started in archaeology, it was a very different field in terms of acknowledgments and engagement with indigenous communities and descendant communities and things like this. And so that's something that my generation of archaeologists has really had to learn and work towards, and sometimes we're more successful than others. And there's no easy answer. Different communities all over the world have they have autonomy, they have their own beliefs, they treat these questions differently. Some groups feel very strongly about the treatment of their ancestral remains in one way, some not so much in the other. I think on the two ends of the spectrum, we can kind of talk about, on one side, there's Native North America. So the tribal Native American cultures and how they feel about treatment of human remains versus then, say, Egypt and the treatment of their ancient human remains. And so it, basically one size does not fit all, and you need to be careful with what you do. That was actually very difficult for me, so I ran afoul of that with my study of those tattooing needles from here in Tennessee. Those were objects from a archaic period burial. So they were funerary objects. And the work that I did looking at them and identifying them was originally rooted in conducting first the analysis of that site, which had been excavated and destroyed in the 1980s, and then as part of our inventory and repatriation process. So when I really started considering that these things were possibly tattooing tools was when we were documenting all of the material from that site in order to repatriate it to federal tribal groups.
Because this is stuff that was dug in much less sensitive times, right? It was stuff that maybe was dug in the 19th century or the early 20th century.
It was dug in the 1980s, but that was
even that late, right?
Yeah, at that point, even then, archaeology is much different science 30, 40 years ago than it is now, and the laws are much different. And so that was actually a very difficult process because, archaeology has been part of this generational trauma for Native American communities. And so, on one hand, there are these colonial processes that erased their tattooing traditions or that contributed to their erasure. And then on the other hand, you have, a white archaeologist working with funerary objects who's saying, hey, check this out. These are your ancestral tattooing tools. And this is a practice that's been happening for 3,000 years. And 5,000 years, I guess, actually, depending on how you read the dates. And that's, some people were very interested in that, and some people were very, very upset that I had published on funerary remains. And, that's just one of those, it's really difficult, and you can't make everybody happy. And so you sort of have to forge your own path. But while you're doing that, you've also got to, be aware of your own biases and, try to do your best. We all try to do better, right?
Yeah, right. I think that's 100%. I mean, you and I have talked about this in other fora. Like, as a historian of tattooing who gets often asked about things and have spoken about things and written about things that I'm not narrowly an expert on, I never want to say I can tell you about X cultural tradition or Y cultural tradition. What I can talk about is really how it was responded to and the legacies of that response from within the things that I can read as someone who can read English and French and German and bits of Dutch and Swedish and other things. But I'm not going to, and I wouldn't dare presume to kind of explain to anybody, let's say, how tattooing works socially in New Zealand or Tahiti or Fiji or wherever. And the people that do that, whether they're from those communities or they're not, have a different kind of expertise. And I think it's difficult to walk that line. But I think, yeah, as you said, it's important to be aware of it.
And increasingly, as you and I have talked about in other settings, there is this ongoing interest among indigenous societies, people refinding and reclaiming and reinterpreting their own histories, their own tattooing traditions, and these are their stories to tell. And so, on one hand, I, as a material culture guy, hope I can contribute to those stories by identifying tools that were used or the archaeological settings in which they were used. But at the same time, it would be incredibly presumptuous of me to then try to say 5,000 years ago in native North America, people were tattooing because X, Y, and Z, and this is what they meant. This is what it meant to them, and this is why it was significant to their culture. That's not my story to tell.
And are you, as an employee of the state of Tennessee, are you accountable in any way also to the Indian nations, like in your region? Like, what's that relationship like?
Yeah, so we as the official government body doing archaeology in the state of Tennessee, we are connected to various kinds of permitting processes at the federal and state level that then have legal requirements attached to them regarding consultations with tribes. We are also, because we count as a federal museum because of our funding, we are also then responsible to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is NAGPRA. And so that's the repatriation process that I mentioned earlier, is that, we are responsible under federal law to identify and try to return human remains and sacred objects to federally recognized tribes.
I mean, just for any listeners who are worried that I used the word Indian, that's unfortunately still the word that exists in the legal system, right? It's called Indian law, and although Native American is obviously the correct and more recent term, unfortunately that term Indian survives in the legal language of the United States.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month, and you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on this chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information. And you mentioned about kind of indigenous people trying to re-examine their own history and kind of reconstruct a lot of these ritual practices. Maybe that's the wrong word to use, but how are people reincorporating the stuff that you've discovered into culture? How are indigenous groups looking at the research that you're conducting of stuff that they might have forgotten or might have been, that history might have been taken away from them? How are they then reincorporating that?
Well, again, I think that's other people's stories to tell, and anecdotally, I know something. I see what people post on social media and tag me in, but they of course are under no obligation to include me in that process, or even let me know what's going on. For example, the cactus spines that we worked with from the American Southwest, within living memory, now very old living memory, but within living memory, people were using cactus spines to tattoo in those regions. And so, this was not an entirely new idea, but this particular tool was utterly unique. This is a 2,000-year-old set of cactus spines stuck into this 10-centimeter long twig and then wrapped around with yucca fragment, with green fragment. And the site that it came from was just, there were individual human hairs preserved at that site. It was just such an amazing preservation circumstance that no tool like this has ever been documented anywhere else in the American Southwest. And so, so in this case, we're able to bring to the table, look, there's this tool type to consider, in addition to, the species of cactus that are being used and things like that. I've done a little bit of work. I've been really honored to be able to put together some sort of white papers on making bone tools and, making bone implements using authentic strategies, pre-industrial, pre-electric strategies to share with practitioners here in the U.S. and in some other places as well, that they are using then in developing their own, how to make these tools and test them out themselves. So that's been a fantastic piece that I've been able to contribute.
Oh, sorry, Tom. Like, one of the things that really interests me as well, it was something that I actually read. It was a sentence that was actually about the rehang of, I think, the British Museum, but it was basically like, essentially Western art gets a timeline and Western culture gets a timeline, and in the encyclopedic museum, and non-Western culture gets a place, right? So you have like 1700 to 1800, and then you get Asia, right? And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in Sebastian and Sean's book about tattooing in Samoa is that they say as well, like, one of the problems that they've come up against when they're trying to write about tattooing in Samoa is there's really difficult, even from those ethnographic accounts, to talk about a history of tattooing in a place, not just what it's like. We can talk about, tattooing in Samoa or tattooing in this particular region of the American Southwest is like this. But of course, you're covering hundreds and thousands of years potentially. So I wonder if, are you able to? How have you been able to document any kind of history, like technological changes over time, or things that are developing in a more sort of in a chronological sense as well as just a geographical one?
Man, I wish, right? Those are the big questions, right? Is like, what were the first tools? I tend to talk a lot about tattooing as being like fire ceramics, right? Like, is it something that is developed independently by every culture across the entire world because it's so deeply rooted in our human psyche? Or is it something that developed once and then diffused out through the entire world along with the earliest waves of human migration. And then, of course, like every other technology, changed along the way. And we are just nowhere near being able to answer that. I mean, I feel like that's the goal. But at this point, we're just throwing up individual data points. You know, like we need the stars in the sky, and right now we have like 2 dots, and that is it.
Yeah, because one of the things, the amazing things that you do is preserve or keep the tattooed mummies database. So you and some colleagues of yours put together a list of like every tattooed mummy from every culture on the planet that we knew about that was preserved, and there ain't that many, right?
There's a couple of hundred, and there are probably a couple hundred more that were, things that were destroyed in the Blitz, I think, and left out on the sands of Egypt in the 1890s, and then this incredible assortment of specimens from South America that have never even been formally documented, things in local or private museums down there that have never been identified or documented. And so
that feels like the next frontier to me. South America feels like the next frontier in this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's sort of where I've been moving recently in my research is just finished up a book chapter looking at tattoos of Andean mummies in American collections. And so these are materials that were, brought back in steamer trunks during that era of, Western travel to South America. They were things that were brought back for World's Fairs. There are some really large collections at ethnographic museums in Europe as well. Hundreds of tattooed mummies from these various sites in South America. But so looking at them here in the United States is something that I've been working with and trying to use modern technologies, right? Whether that's infrared photography that can reveal faded or indistinct tattoos. There's a couple other digital methods that we can use, digital color space models that can help pull out faint tattoos, but also looking at them under high-powered digital microscopes. And that for me has been like, that's the thing I'm excited about, right? Is, again, like we have this history of people sort of waving their hands and saying, oh, South American mummy tattoos are stitched or they are, whatever. But, those look different, right? Different tattoos done with different tools look different. And if we can get access to, experimental archaeology to build our database, and then to tattooed preserved remains, we can compare these lines of evidence and see, do these physically match with one another? And sometimes they may, and sometimes they may not. You all talked about Ötzi the other day, and I think Matt, as I recall, parroted the bad information about Ötzi's tattoos being incised. Which is that's the next thing we're working on. There is a paper about that. So yeah,
I might have got that from a book that you edited. So don't blame me too much.
I mean, in fairness, it's what appears on the museum website.
Yeah.
But again, there's an interesting disconnect there of, there's this history of scholarship in which non-tattooed academics say this happened this way. And that doesn't match up either with what we know about the historical scope of tattooing technologies, or in this case, the actual physical evidence of the thing.
Yeah, I think the best example of that, which is also an archaeological one, and I don't know if you've mentioned it on the podcast already, Tom and I have definitely talked about it, is all that Keimer stuff from Egypt, where he was like, oh, all of the people with all these mummies with tattoos are women. It's the 1940s in France. The only people that have tattoos, as far as I'm concerned, are prostitutes. Therefore, these tattooed women must be prostitutes, right? And that colors not just tattoo history, but also kind of history of, gender and social hierarchies and all kinds of things in Egyptology for decades because someone's misunderstood the tattoos.
Yeah. Well, I think there's that fundamental misunderstanding, and I'm writing on this right now about how that sort of informs the interpretation of Ötzi's tattoos. We have this sort of broad spectrum idea that they are medicinal or that they're therapeutic, and there's some physical evidence for that, but some of them are at locations on his body where there do not seem to be underlying health conditions. And if you actually drill back into the literature, you find that the reasoning that was originally based on was their locations, but was also this idea that they don't represent anything. So in other words, they're lines, they're groups of lines. So even though they have structure, even though they have orientation, they're grouped in stylistic manners, but modern people don't understand what those things mean, so they must not mean anything.
Yeah, I had all the opposite, right? They look like they mean something, therefore they do mean something, right? So I had a good chat with Luc Renaud, who's an amazing sort of, again, sort of early modern, he's just one of the smartest people I know. Writes about lots of tattooing from lots of places. But I wrote a thing in my book about the Egyptian mummies and the Gabeline mummies and the new ones from Hathor or the Hathor ones from Dar el Medina, and the standard, the Egyptologists that have written about those are like, well, they are cultish, they are representative of status, and Luke was basically like, and I'm paraphrasing him here, and he'd be much more cautious than this, but he was basically like, look, like, just now, if you've got the same tattoo as someone else, doesn't mean you do the same job as them. You might just like the same stuff, right? It might just be a hit. We don't know, because as you said, we haven't got very many data points, and it's really one of my issues with anthropologists more so than archaeologists is that anthropologists will often make the data fit their pre-existing hypothesis or their pre-existing.
Matt, we're behind the paywall. Talk your shit. Academic beef. It's been a couple of episodes.
Well, no, I think, like, if you're going to presume, for example, that every tattoo is significant of social status, then you're going to go, this person has this tattoo, therefore this must have been their social status. But if you come at it from a different perspective, which is like, maybe this guy thought that his bull tattoo was cool, you're going to have a slightly different, and there really is no way.
You've got to be conservative. Yeah. And I think you even said this on an earlier one. I think you Matt, said something to the effect of that, like, it's reductivist. That just because we don't understand a symbol doesn't mean that it doesn't communicate some sort of non-written language, some sort of understanding about who that person was. Now, just one more thing about Otzi. The third line of evidence for his tattoos not being, or being primarily medicinal or therapeutic, that's been given is that because they were located on parts of his body that were covered by clothes, they must not have been meaningful because no one could see them. And that is, I think, exactly what you're talking. That's that old academic, like, well, if no one can see the tattoo, then it means nothing. It's just fundamentally wrong.
Academics and teenagers have the exact same idea. If I can't see a tattoo, how will people know I'm cool?
It only matters if you put it on the neck.
What are future anthropologists going to think of my giant Neon Genesis Evangelion tattoo when I'm perfectly mummified sitting in this chair producing podcasts?
You're going to be
80.
the only survivor from this culture, right? And in 5,000 years, it'll be like everyone worships this thing.
Or like, it was back pain. He was addressing his back pain. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's critical, Matt. Right? I think archaeology and anthropology both have, their own histories of this to contend with. Of making, as you said, making the story fit the facts instead of putting out the facts as being a data point along the road that might help other people in the future.
So can I ask you then about, again, going back to North America or North American tattooing in its wider context and sort of the politics of it, because, whether it's kind of reading what a tattoo means, I was so fascinated by the political response, and again, I think we talked about it in a previous episode, the political response to the Altai princess, the Ochibala specimen, a woman from the Altai Mountains who, she gets to be repatriated, but only on the say-so of Gazprom. So this gets really political, and one of the things that's really interested me, and you and I have, again, I've talked about because I asked you about it because it made no sense to me, is why North American tattooing was so visible in European discourse from 1492 all the way up until the 18th century, and then not straight away with those Pacific encounters, but quite quickly afterwards, people were pretending never to have, not even pretending, but the claim was that there was no tattooing known about even before the 18th century or the late 18th century. So could you talk a bit about like what happened in the historical discourse about the tattooing traditions that you write about and study? Like why did they get pushed out of cultural memory in European thought for a best part of a century?
That is a great question, Matt. I mean, and I think I don't know the answer. I think honestly that the things you all have talked about on here, you know, we do see a similar thing, and I don't know if it's, to my mind, there may be that, these earliest accounts where it's so visible are, they're documentarian. Whether it is people recording the list of riches and the land so that they know what they're inventorying, what they want to be their possessions, right? And so as part of that, you have these early naturalists, whether it's John White or someone else, who are recording flora and fauna and the indigenous peoples. And, so they're doing it with this eye towards realism. Now, of course, John White is also drawing some things that are just utter horseshit. Tattooed natives from Florida where he never set foot, based entirely on his own imagination, right? Or the tattooed Britons that you all have talked about in the past too, right? 5,000 years earlier than John White. But and at a certain point, I think, as you've talked about with the Pacific, that historical dialogue changes and it stops being as much about curiosity and starts being more about commodification, conquest, ownership. And so things that have in the past been much more flowery and descriptive turn much more legal, turn much more factual. They deal with the day-to-day, things like sales of goods rather than 7 paragraphs about walking into the village for the first time and how the chief's daughter inevitably fell in love with whoever that was. Like that story on its own, by the way, is a fantastic cross-cultural thing. I think you guys talked about this in the Pacific, that idea of the chiefly daughter who falls in love with the transculturite and he becomes tattooed and a man of the culture. And I mean, that shows up in the Americas. It shows up in all these different places.
That story got told about Edward VII tattoo in Jerusalem, right? That he goes in and the tattooist's daughter is very comely and attractive, and that's why he steps foot over the threshold into the tattoo studio in Jerusalem in 1861. It's because the tattooer had a sexy young daughter. So yeah, that story is very, very trans-historical.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also then, simultaneous to that, there is the acculturative process, right? And I think this happens in the Pacific too. So you go, whether it's language or whether it's tools or whether it's clothing, people are adapting or being forced to adapt to European ways of dress and thought. And so there's the religious aspect to that, cover your sinful naked body. There is the urge to not look quote unquote savage, but to try to acculturate with the, perceived to be more wealthy, more powerful nation that's come over the mountains. There is Native American tattooing in a lot of communities through the early 1900s, mid 1900s. And that's sort of the last generation. And I think, to my mind, that really sort of corresponds then with that, that push of golden age America, where tattooing again is sort of reclaimed as being, on the bodies of Americans, but not necessarily on the bodies of those other people. So it's almost like it reverses course to that historical dialogue, whereas before it was like the tattooed savage body. Well, now it's, the tattooed American body versus the savage who is out on the periphery and doesn't do these things. Or, how many of the women in the sideshows had a narrative in which they were captured and tattooed by Native Americans, but conspicuously and obviously not, right? I mean, all their tattoos are Americana, they're straight out of Cap Coleman's book, but that's the story that they're selling.
Yeah, there's that interesting book about someone who I think probably was tattooed by in native cultures, the Olive Oatman book that Margot Mifflin did. But the storytelling and the kind of noble savage stuff has really clouded this so much, and it makes the study of it so complicated. And that's why I love what you're doing, because you're trying to, with the insights that you have, pull out some kernels of truth from that bullshit, but also then go, let's look at the evidence and see what we can see and see what we can reveal. And that's what's super exciting. I guess, so going back to on that again, trying to kind of go against the bullshit, how is there a way, for example, that you can do what you've been doing with needles in North American context with turkey bone and cactus spines, and think about ways that would apply to the copper needles that we find in Europe, for example, that those contested ones with Otzi and with the other Central European examples, because I think, is it just a sort of material fact that you can do this kind of analysis on bone and plant, thorn, and it's harder to do on metal?
It should work if the preservation allows for it, right? And so that is the big unknown, is that, metal, for example, depending on the type of metal, will corrode. And that is a thing that no one has yet looked at, is, what does the corrosive process on, say, bronze awls do to use wear patterns? I don't know enough about metallurgy to know. It might affect it, it might not. Same thing with botanical materials. Like, in theory, if they survive, we could do these same studies, but it is so rare that those materials survive in the archaeological record.
And the ones you're looking at, are they often funerary, or are they always funerary? Are there ones that just happen to be preserved in the sites, or are they always kind of things that are packaged and kept with bodies?
Well, so that's a great question. Yeah, so the ones that we identified here from Tennessee as tattooing needles, they were funerary, and it was the assemblage, it was the packaging of those alongside pigment processing materials and a couple of other artifact types, bivalve shells, so a half shells that had evidence of pigment being in them, and another type of bone tool that seemed to have been used to mix pigment and then had polish on it, I think from being used to apply that pigment to the skin. So that's what made these tools stand out to me as being, meriting further investigation. Now, having said that, there are dozens of sharpened bone tools from that same site that are made, using different kinds of bones, probably used for different reasons. There are millions of bone tools in native North America that may have been used for all kinds of things. And so that then sort of becomes this problem of science of, there is not enough expertise or time or money to go look at every single one of those to see what it might be. And so to my mind, we really have to pick our battles. And for me, that building that contextual case is really important. And so I'm really intrigued whenever I hear an archaeologist talking or writing about cosmetic kits, right, or painting kits, or situations where you have sharpened bone tools.
He's talking about someone very specific here, but not saying their name. So carry on.
talking about sharpened. That's fine. It's fine. Sharpened bone tools in association with pigments, and that's not a silver bullet. They might be or they might not be, but we don't know unless we look.
Because again, as someone who tries to focus more on European stuff than things elsewhere, like, the kind of work you've done just hasn't been done in Europe, and the studies that I'd love to see are exactly of the kind you've just described, but they just don't exist. And sort of fighting against not only the kind of absence of those studies, but outright fraud. You put on your Instagram page a while ago the story of Alfred Deek and the bog bodies, which were outright fabricated. I'd love to have an Aaron Deter Wolf in every single, and the people you work with, in every single cultural context, because I think the methodology you've developed is just really important, basically.
And that's been an interesting thing, is to watch that pendulum swing. While now I feel like there's an enthusiasm. There's more enthusiasm for the idea than there is actual expertise, right? And so you have guys like Christian Gates St. Pierre who know this stuff, who absolutely know it. You have people who are experts in this field. I came into this blind 10 years ago, was the first time I said, I think those things might be tattooing tools. And I spent a decade learning use-wear, right? Like doing experimental archaeology, using these tools for different things, looking at them under microscopes, replicating that experiment until I could tell the difference before I then said out loud in print, this is what I think these things are. And so there's almost this sort of shift now where we're seeing people start to embrace these ideas, but then not follow through with the methodology or the knowledge. So it may be someone, I saw this paper out of Mexico a while ago where, guy, made a bunch of tools and took them and tattooed pigskin with them. And, surprise, surprise, obsidian blades can tattoo, right? I mean, that's our base level, right? It's sharp enough to puncture the skin. But does it mean that these specific blades from this specific site were used that way? Well, the archaeologist may say so, but what is your actual evidence for that?
So what are the frontiers then? So you're starting to look at some Andean mummies, are they, or Chilean? Like, what are you working on now?
Yeah, Andean broadly. So there's I know you're familiar with the Oxford Handbook on the Archaeology of Tattooing and Body Modification that's going to be coming out next year.
Everyone I know got asked to write for that apart from me, so I'm really annoyed.
Come on, your stuff just isn't old enough, man.
No, I know, it's true. I'm really looking forward to that. There's going to be an amazing essay in that book about the first kind of good history of body piercing is going to be in that book. Like, I know you're doing a thing. Benoit Robitaille emailed me today to ask me some stuff that he's putting in his chapter for that book, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, Ben and Maya and I are co-authoring a chapter that's basically Ben's database of ethnographic tool distributions.
That's what he asked me about today, so yeah, that's cool.
My friend Andrew and I, Andrew was the lead author on the cactus spine paper, so he and I wrote a paper that is this kind of methodological approach. It's basically like, here's how we use real honest-to-God science to identify tattooing artifacts. And it's going to cause some waves because along the way it kind of specifically calls out the mistakes that have been made, the different approaches that don't really apply, whether that's,
academic
raw
beef.
Right. But whether it's raw intuition, this looks sharp, therefore it must be a tattoo tool, or
Aaron did that specifically with it was actually a comment thread on my Facebook page, actually, about a radiocarbon dating error in the literature on Otzi.
Otzi the Iceman, yeah.
And it was Aaron and Benoit and Lars as well, was it? Or who else? Sebastian basically kind of figured out that somebody had made a quite basic error in the radiocarbon dating of Otzi. Oh no, not of Otzi, of these Chilean mummies.
Chilean mummies, yeah. And artificially added 2,000 years. Yeah. Yeah, that was an amazing thread, right? We unbusted the myth of the Chilean mummies.
I was like, oh my god! Yeah, because basically they'd been listed as BC rather than BP, which shifts the date by 2,000 years, and over the citation history of it had been misprinted, and no one had gone back and checked the originals until you guys did it. And it was, those kind of things that you're doing and really going back to the evidence is such great stuff.
Hopefully it's useful to people, right? And looking ahead, I'd love to find a grant or some funds. I'm not at a university, so I don't have that kind of grant funding, but to actually go to South America and work in some of those collections. I have that technology now. I have infrared cameras. We have D-Stretch as a carry-on your iPhone now. I have these microscopes. It would be incredible to go down there and do that work, but let's be honest, it's going to take a month if it takes a day, right? And, and there's going to be all the permissions and all this kind of thing. And, I got 2 kids at home and a full-time job. So we'll just file that away for after retirement, maybe. I don't know.
We're gonna chat to Maya next week. So I'll ask her about this as well. But could you also talk a bit about the work that you did with her on this new tool, this new technology, the double poke thing, which she kind of and you and Benoit have been talking about?
Yeah, now that is entirely Maya. They convinced me of that, but I contributed very little to that discussion. So she is going to be the go-to source on that. But the gist of it is that, this is again one of these things that people have talked for years about skin stitching, right? As being this one kind of tattooing, and it turns out that when you look at the global sample, that there are a number of different techniques that involve putting pigment laterally under the skin between 2 punctures. And it's not just pulling thread or pulling sinew with a needle. There's also these other techniques. And so I think we've sort of unofficially started calling it subdermal tattooing. This idea that you're, sort of poking things through the skin sideways rather than vertically or at an angle down into it. But so that tool that Maya's identified is one of those forms of subdermal tattooing that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, it was so interesting, and I'm looking forward to talk to her about that in more detail next week. Yeah. Have you got any stupid questions, Thomas? Because you said you had to. No. You haven't had any yet so far.
No, to be honest, I think I'm just kind of awestruck by this conversation. I think it's completely fascinating. I come from a completely different academic tradition of economics, which technically isn't a science. The Nobel Prize in Economics isn't actually a real Nobel Prize for anyone listening.
Archaeology isn't real science either. It's fine.
It's going out and getting dusty with your friends. But I honestly don't. I think you've answered everything that I could have asked. Where can people find you online? Where can people interact with the stuff that you do? How can people support what you do? And how can people get smarter and not be less ignorant?
So I think, the one big takeaway for me for all of this tattoo research stuff has been trust but verify. Just because you read it online, just because you read it in an old source, doesn't mean it's right? You can go to 19th century.
Even if someone says it in an old source, don't believe it's true.
Don't believe it's true, right? You can go to 19th century medical journals and learn about how leaching and amputation were the best ways to treat certain diseases, but it turns out that's not right because science has come a long way. And I think tattooing studies and tattoo history suffer from that to a certain extent because it's so popular in the public that a lot of people don't have that skeptical grounding for evaluating old sources. So the question of tattooing in the British Isles is, I think, a great example of that, where people are like, oh, but there's this really old picture from John White that shows tattooed pics. Therefore, there were tattooed pics. Or the Viking tattooing question is the same way. You've got to interrogate your sources very carefully. And just because an English translation, a modern English translation of something says this or may say this, doesn't mean that's actually what's going on. Check the original language, check the original sources, do your reading, do your homework. As far as finding me online, Ben and I do the Archaeology Inc. at Archaeology Inc. on Instagram. That feed's been pretty quiet for a little while here. I've sort of fallen off that. I don't know if it's coming back or not, but there's some good stuff down the feed, really, at least, if people want to learn some things. And then if you just Google search me, you can find my pages on ResearchGate or Academia, and I upload papers to those pages. And I love this stuff, man. I mean, I'll sit around for hours and talk about this stuff, just like you guys. And anybody who ever has questions, man, reach out. Shoot me an email, shoot me a text, whatever.
Aaron's edited a couple of books, both of which are amazing. The Ancient Ink book, which I recommend to people all the time, which he edited with Lars Kritak, is on University of Washington Press from a few years ago, and just an incredible, the best. If you want to know about old tattooing, it's just the best and most up to date, more or less, account of all kinds of things. There's articles in there or chapters in there about ancient Egypt, about Native America, about European tattooing, Iron Age tattooing in Europe. There's stuff about Otzi in there. There's all kinds of amazing stuff in that book, and it's such an important and great collection. And then the other one you did was called Drawing with Great Needles, right? That was more specifically focused on Native North American tattoo traditions.
Yeah, Eastern North America and the Great Plains specifically. So sort of rooted in the late prehistoric period, and then moving through into the historic documentation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, in working on what I've been working on recently, I've been so many kind of very pantomimed and imagined images of tattooed Native American savages, and so it's always so good to go back to your work and kind of look at where the serious science, where the serious archaeology, and where the serious cautious social anthropology and oral history and paleoanthropology stuff intersects with that 19th century or even 17th and 18th century anthropologist, gentleman explorer going, oh, this is odd.
Right. From their armchair.
Yeah, because you pointed out to me, and this is again something which I didn't know, you pointed out to me that even some of those images of the Native American people that came to the British Isles, for example, you were like, those tattoos aren't from that culture. The person that drew them was just making it up. They've got tattoos, probably make it look like this. So that kind of caution and yeah, that's what I really appreciate in what you do, Aaron.
Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate that.
And if you are listening to the show, or if you're listening to this episode, you support us on Patreon. So a big thank you to all of you. And if you're listening to it on the free feed in a couple of months, support the Patreon. You get more deep history. You get to hear about academic beef. You get to hear about Matt making mistakes and getting pulled up by other academics. You get to hear all of my unedited stupid questions. And if you want to find us, you probably already know already if you subscribe to the feed, it's at Beneath Skin Pod on Twitter. You can find me at Got It at Guineys. That's GUYNEYS. Matt, where can everyone find you if they don't follow you already? I'm pretty sure anyone who listens to this show already follows you, and anyone who's like anyone follows you, but...
As I always say, at Matt Lodder, smoke signal, carrier pigeon, shout, yodel.
Semaphore.
My understanding is that if you just get off the train somewhere in the UK and say, hey, do you know that tattoo guy, Matt, that someone will get me to you?
I mean, that
sooner
is,
or later,
I
right?
have to say, I'm not wishing to toot my own horn in any way, but that is, people have done that, and it's quite terrifying.
No, what you do is it's like Bloody Mary if you go into the bathroom at night and say, have you heard tattooing is now more acceptable than ever? 3 times in a mirror, Matt appears behind you.
You see, I was doing the wrong thing. I was trying not just for sailors, criminals, and prostitutes.